This 1854 family portrait looks like an ordinary keepsake until you zoom in on a small hand in the background, and everything about it changes. The photograph arrived at Thomas Harper's office on a cold February morning in 2024, delivered by courier in a plain brown package. Thomas, a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, had examined thousands of historical images across his 20-year career. This one made him stop breathing for a moment. It showed a wealthy family posed before a Greek Revival mansion, tall white columns unmistakably speaking of Southern prosperity, circa 1854. A stern father in a dark suit stood with one hand on an ornate chair. A mother in elaborate silk, layered in crinolines, sat beside three children dressed in their finest, all serious-faced, in the formal way people held themselves for a daguerreotype, back straight, chins level, the whole family arranged like a still life meant to advertise its own success. But it wasn't the posed family that caught Thomas's attention. In the background, half obscured by morning light filtering through the columns, sat two smaller figures, children on the ground, almost invisible in the composition, the kind of detail a less careful eye would scan straight past. Thomas leaned closer, pulse quickening. One child was white, 7 or 8, light hair catching the sun. The other was black, roughly the same age, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They were absorbed in something on the ground between them, entirely oblivious to the formal portrait being taken a few feet away. Thomas had studied hundreds of antebellum photographs. He knew how these images were composed, how enslaved people, when they appeared at all, were positioned rigidly at the edges, clearly marked as property, arranged so no one looking at the print could mistake who belonged to whom. This was different. These two children were playing together as equals, their posture suggesting familiarity rather than the rigid hierarchy that defined the world around them. Dr. Harper, his assistant Rebecca, appeared with coffee. The donor note says it came from an estate outside Charleston. Family clearing out a property that's been theirs since before the war. Found boxes of photographs in the attic. Thomas didn't look away from the image. Any documentation? Letters, diaries, names? Rebecca handed him a small tin box, folded letters, a leather journal, and a paper listing names in faded ink. The Harrison family, 1854. Edward Harrison, Sarah Harrison, Edward Jr., William, Margaret, Samuel, Joseph. 7 names for a photograph that showed 5 people posed and 2 more in the background. Edward and Sarah were the parents. Edward Jr., William, and Margaret, the 3 formally posed children. That left Samuel and Joseph, one a Harrison child, the other enslaved. Thomas turned the photograph over. A pencil inscription, barely visible, Sam and Joseph. Summer 1854. Forever friends. His hands trembled. This wasn't a family portrait. It was documentation of something forbidden, a friendship between a white child and an enslaved child, carefully labeled by someone who wanted it remembered. Thomas spent 3 days with the museum's imaging technology, scanning at high resolution, enhancing faded regions, coaxing detail from 170 years of decay. What emerged was remarkable and unsettling. The white boy, presumably Samuel, the Harrisons' 4th child, wore plain clothes next to his siblings' finery, barefoot, trousers rolled at the ankle, hair disheveled from hours of play. Beside him, the black boy Joseph wore rougher cotton that marked him unmistakably as enslaved, but his posture struck Thomas hard. He wasn't crouched or positioned to show deference. He sat exactly as Samuel sat, their bodies mirroring each other with an ease that spoke of real familiarity. Between them on the ground, once Thomas enhanced the area enough, he made out carved wooden soldiers arranged in formation, 2 boys deep in an imaginary battle, the way children have played for centuries. Then he zoomed in on Joseph's right hand, the one nearest Samuel, and his breath caught. A scar ran across the boy's palm, deliberate, unmistakable. Thomas had seen enough antebellum documents to know exactly what he was looking at. A brand, a mark of ownership applied the way livestock were marked, on a child who couldn't have been more than 7. He sat back, the image doing something to his stomach. This single photograph held two truths at once, a horror and something tender sitting side by side as if they belonged in the same frame. Because they did, and because no one who arranged that portrait had ever meant for anyone, a century and a half later, to look this closely. Rebecca brought census and property records. Edward Harrison owned a plantation called Riverside, about 15 miles outside Charleston. 47 enslaved people in 1850, 62 by 1860. The 1850 census hadn't bothered to name enslaved individuals, only age and gender, lines in a ledger meant to track property, not people. There's something else, Rebecca added. A Charleston Society column from 1856. The Harrisons at a Christmas ball with their 3 children. Not 4. Samuel isn't mentioned, not that year, not in anything after. Thomas asked her to keep digging, and over the following days she surfaced more of the same shape. Tax rolls listing Riverside's acreage and its human property side by side without distinction. A church membership record for the Harrison family that quietly dropped Samuel's name from the family pew listing after 1856. A probate inventory years later that would count Riverside's enslaved workers by dollar value alongside its livestock and furniture. None of it was unusual for the period. That was the point. A whole apparatus of paperwork existed to make what had happened to Joseph and to Samuel look ordinary. The leather journal belonged to Sarah Harrison, the mother in the photograph, elegant, controlled handwriting, entries running 1852 to 1858. The kind of record a well-bred woman kept as much for posterity as for herself. Thomas read methodically. Early entries were mundane: parties, weather, notes on the children's progress, Edward Jr.'s aptitude for mathematics, William's love of horses, Margaret's skill at piano. Samuel appeared less often, and differently, always as a small worry, never as an accomplishment. March 1853, Samuel continues to resist his tutors. He shows no interest in the classics or proper comportment. I fear Samuel will never learn to take his place in society as his brothers will. July. I found Samuel playing with the servants' children again. I have spoken to him repeatedly about maintaining proper distance, but he does not listen. Edward says I am too lenient. Perhaps. He is right. Reading it, Thomas got the sense of a child who simply didn't fit the shape his family had built for him, and a mother who read that as failure rather than temperament. By April 1854, a name enters the journal, though Sarah never once writes it directly, only the boy or the child from the quarters. Samuel has formed an attachment, she writes, to the boy Joseph we acquired last year. They spend hours together, and I confess I have allowed it, because it keeps Samuel occupied and out of Edward's notice. She allows it, she admits, not because she sees anything wrong in it, but because she already understands, instinctively, that it's dangerous, and would rather not have to think too hard about why. Through that spring and summer, her entries track a friendship deepening. June, she watches the boys building a fort by the creek, engaged in elaborate games of soldiers and battles. Samuel calls Joseph his best friend, his only real friend. His brothers, he says, are mean and don't understand him. I did not know what to say. Sarah writes, how does one explain to a 7-year-old child that friendship across such lines is impossible? August 15, 1854, the day of the portrait. Samuel slipped away during preparations and came back with Joseph and dirt on his good clothes. He refused to send his friend away, and the photographer, visibly uncomfortable, proceeded anyway. Sarah watched them play in the background as the image was taken. I wonder what future generations will think, she wrote. A proper family portrait, with 2 children playing behind it, one white and one Negro, as if such friendship were natural. Perhaps in some distant future it will be. Not in ours. The tone shifted weeks later, in September. On the 7th, Edward finally found them, Samuel teaching Joseph his letters from a primer in the library. He struck his son, forbade him from ever speaking to the boy again. Samuel wept, insisted Joseph was his friend, that friends help each other learn. Slaves are not friends. Edward told him. They are property, and Samuel must learn this truth. Thomas felt his chest tighten reading it. A 7-year-old, struck for teaching his friend to read brutal, and entirely consistent with a system that understood literacy in enslaved hands as a threat to everything it depended on. Samuel was confined to his room for 5 days, meals taken in silence. Edward ordered the house slaves to report any attempt to contact Joseph. Samuel asked me today why Joseph couldn't be his friend, Sarah wrote. How do I explain to my child that the world we live in forbids love across the color line? 2 weeks later, the entry Thomas had feared arrived. September 28, 1854, Edward had sold Joseph to a trader bound for New Orleans. Not for anything the boy had done for the challenge his friendship with Samuel represented to Edward's authority, and for the inconvenient softness it had put in his son. He was taken that morning while Samuel was at lessons. No goodbye, no warning. Samuel didn't yet know. Thomas had to stand and walk to the window, looking down at the street, trying to steady himself. A child, sold and separated from everything he knew, because a friendship had made someone uncomfortable in his own house. The next entry described what happened when Samuel found out hysterical, screaming that it wasn't fair, trying to run from the house to bring Joseph home himself. Edward caught him and locked him in the cellar. I can hear Samuel crying even now, Sarah wrote, hours later. He keeps calling Joseph's name. Edward's justification, relayed second-hand in her own entry, was that this was necessary, that Samuel had to learn his place. Sarah wrote that she wasn't certain her son would ever forgive them. She turned out to be right. What followed, over the next months, was a mother's precise, anguished record of a child disappearing from the inside out. By October, Samuel had nearly stopped speaking, meals in silence, lessons done mechanically, hours spent staring toward the slave quarters as if Joseph might reappear. His tutor reported he shows no interest in studies and seems present only in body. Sarah wrote that something had changed behind his eyes, a coldness she didn't recognize, as though her son had gone somewhere she couldn't follow him to. In November, Sarah found him in the library, tracing his finger over the photograph. He asked if she remembered how happy he'd been that day. He asked if she thought Joseph was happy, wherever he was. She couldn't lie to him. I did not know, she told him, but I hoped so. Samuel answered, He's not happy, Mother. He can't be happy without his friend, just like I can't be happy without mine. Then, if we're supposed to be good Christians, why did Father do something so cruel? She had no answer. Nightmares followed that winter, Samuel waking the house, dreaming Joseph was calling for him, asking why Samuel had let him be taken. By January 1855, he'd stopped eating properly, grown thin and pale. The family doctor, finding no physical cause, diagnosed melancholia and recommended discipline and fresh air. Edward took this literally, sending Samuel out riding for hours he took no joy in, going through the motions of a childhood that no longer meant anything to him. By 1856, nothing had worked. His tutor gave up on him entirely, and that fall Edward sent him to a Virginia military academy, convinced discipline would cure what he called Samuel's weakness. It didn't. Disciplinary reports piled up, refusing orders, sleeping through the day, a fight after another, cadets' remark about the inferior races. Instructors described him alternately as insolent and absent. A boy who followed commands only when it suited him and stared through his superiors the rest of the time, as if the entire apparatus of rank and discipline meant nothing next to what he'd already lost. In March 1856, the school withdrew him, writing to Edward that the boy showed a dangerous sympathy for Negro slaves that interferes with his ability to accept proper authority. Edward's response was total. Samuel would live at Riverside, but was no longer welcome at family functions or in public with them. As far as Charleston is concerned, Sarah wrote, Edward and I now have only 3 children. A 9-year-old, erased from his own family's public existence, quietly written out of the story his family told about itself. The following February, Edward exiled him further still, a small farmhouse on the county's outskirts, an overseer instead of a tutor, manual labor instead of school. Sarah argued that Samuel was 10 years old, that he belonged in a schoolroom, not a field. Edward wouldn't hear it. Sarah's visits grew rare after that. In August 1858, after 6 months apart, she found her son taller, thinner, hands calloused from work, answering her in monosyllables like a stranger. Finally, she asked if he was happy. He looked at her with eyes far older than 11 should carry. "I stopped being happy 4 years ago, Mother," he said. "I stopped being happy the day you let Father sell Joseph." She had no response. It was the last entry that mentioned him directly. Her journal trailed into ordinary entries about weather and household matters before stopping mid-sentence in March 1859. Thomas found her death certificate, Sarah Harrison, dead April 15, 1859, age 41, cause listed simply as fever, a word 19th century families often used to avoid naming what had actually taken someone. He wondered, reading it, whether she had died carrying the specific weight of having watched her son break and done nothing large enough to stop it. Edward died the following February, likely of a stroke. The probate record called it apoplexy, the period's word for the same thing. Guardianship of the youngest children passed briefly to 20-year-old Edward Jr., who handed Samuel's guardianship to his brother William almost immediately, as if even his own siblings had learned, by then, to pass Samuel along like something no one wanted to be responsible for. When war broke out in 1861, Samuel, 14, underage even by wartime standards, enlisted as a private in the 1st South Carolina Infantry. Not the cavalry unit his brother's status would have called for, but a regular infantry regiment of non-slave-holding men and poor farmers, the kind of company a Harrison son had no obvious business joining. His service record carried a line Thomas hadn't expected: assigned to the medical corps, demonstrated unusual aptitude for caring for wounded without regard to rank or circumstance. A colleague specializing in Civil War medicine sent Thomas letters from the regimental surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, preserved in South Carolina's archives. In September 1862, Webb wrote of a boy who claims to be 16 but looks younger, who'd insisted on helping with the wounded until Webb finally relented and discovered a rare gift for medicine and an even rarer capacity for compassion. Samuel tended privates and officers with the same attention, and more remarkable still, and considered inappropriate by others, offered comfort to wounded black soldiers taken captive, speaking to them with a kindness few others extended. Asked why, he told Webb simply that suffering doesn't distinguish between conditions of birth. Thomas read that line twice. A boy who had watched his own family decide that some suffering mattered and some didn't had grown into a man who refused to make that same distinction, on a battlefield where almost everyone else around him still did. Webb's letters described more than a single conversation. Over the following weeks he wrote of Samuel working through the night beside dying men, of him learning to set bones and clean wounds faster than surgeons twice his age, of officers grumbling that a private had no business speaking so familiarly to captured enemy soldiers regardless of what color they were. Webb defended him anyway. "Whatever this boy carries with him," he wrote to his colleague, "it has made him more useful to me than men with twice his training." Samuel served until Antietam that September, the single bloodiest day of the war, over 22,000 casualties where he was badly wounded, his right arm shattered. He refused amputation and, against the odds, kept the limb, though he'd never fully regain its use. Discharged that November as unfit for duty, he didn't go home to Charleston. A passenger record shows him sailing from Richmond to Philadelphia that December, at 15, walking away from his family, his region, everything he'd known, into Union territory. Desertion, in Confederate eyes, and a betrayal of his class and region besides. He did it anyway. Philadelphia Quaker records picked up his trail in January 1863. A youth of perhaps 16 years came to our meeting house today, having traveled from Richmond. He is wounded in his right arm and appears malnourished and exhausted. He says he can no longer fight for a cause he does not believe in. He says he once had a friend who was a slave, and he wishes to honor that friendship by helping others gain freedom through education. The Quakers gave him refuge, and Samuel found his purpose there in a way nothing at Riverside had ever offered him. Records show him working with Freedmen's Aid societies through the rest of the war, teaching literacy and basic medicine to people who'd escaped to Union lines, the same two things, Thomas noted, that had first bound him to Joseph as a child: letters and the simple act of tending to someone else's pain. By 1868, he was an instructor at a Washington teacher training school, preparing black educators, training the people who would go on to teach the children of the formerly enslaved, multiplying, generation by generation, the thing his own father had once tried to beat out of him. Then, in 1870, a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau that brought Thomas closest to tears. Samuel had written it himself. In the same careful hand Thomas recognized from his service records, "I am searching for a man who would now be approximately 24 years old. His name is Joseph, and he was sold from Charleston, South Carolina, to a sugar plantation in Louisiana in 1854. He had a scar on his right palm from a brand. He was my closest friend as a child, and we were separated when we were both 7 years old. I have spent the last 8 years working to help free and educate formerly enslaved people, but I have never stopped hoping I might find him alive." The Bureau's records showed no reply, no letter back, no confirmation either way. Samuel never married, never had children of his own. He spent the rest of his life teaching, until his death from pneumonia in 1891, at 44, still not knowing whether the search had ever reached the person it was meant for. Along the way, Thomas had traced what he could of Joseph too. A ledger from a New Orleans slave trading firm, digitized by a historian at Tulane, listed an October 1854 sale: boy, age approx. 8 years. Name given as Joseph. Purchased from E. Harrison, Charleston, SC. Light scarring on right palm. Sold to sugar plantation, Bayou Tech, Louisiana. Price $650. $650, a child's future, worth less to Edward Harrison than the cost of a good horse. Sugar plantations carried some of the highest mortality rates of any form of enslaved labor in the South. The work was seasonal and brutal, the harvest season alone stretching men and children alike to 18-hour days over boiling cane, and overseers on the Louisiana sugar coast had a reputation among enslaved people that even other plantations feared. Sending an 8-year-old there was, in practical terms, a slow death sentence rather than a fast one. A partial 1856 inventory from a plantation in St. Mary Parish listed Joseph, field hand, age approx. 10 years. The boy had survived at least 2 brutal years already, longer than many adults managed. After that, the paper trail went dark. Plantation records grew sparse through the war. Many burned or scattered as Union forces moved through Louisiana, and Thomas found nothing more to follow. Thomas presented everything at the Organization of American Historians Conference in April 2025. The hall packed past capacity. The 1854 photograph filling the screen behind him, the posed Harrison family in front, and in the background, 2 small boys who didn't know they were being watched by history. He walked the audience through all 6 years of it: the friendship, the discovery, the sale, the decline, the war, the letter that never got an answer. By the time he finished, the room had gone very quiet. "This photograph documents something the record tried to erase," he told them. A friendship between a white child and an enslaved child. It led to one boy's exile from his own family, and eventually to a life spent fighting the very system that had taken his friend. After the talk, an elderly man approached Robert Washington, a retired teacher from Louisiana, hands trembling around an old photograph of his own. "My great-great-grandfather was named Joseph," he said. "He survived a Louisiana sugar plantation, became a teacher himself after the war. He used to tell my grandfather about a white boy who taught him his letters and was kind to him when he was 7 years old. I never knew if it was really true or just a story that got softer with each telling the kind families keep because it feels better than whatever actually happened." He turned the photo around, an elderly black man standing before a schoolhouse, dignified in a dark coat, hands folded in front of him. On the back, Joseph Washington, teacher, 1895. in memory of a friend who showed me letters and kindness when I was 7 years old. Thomas's hands shook. The timeline lined up exactly the age, the year, the scar the ledger had described on a boy who'd since built himself an entire life out of nothing anyone had given him. "I think he survived," Thomas said quietly, "and I think he remembered Samuel the same way Samuel remembered him. They never found each other again, but they both became teachers. They both spent their lives helping other people learn. They carried the friendship forward, even after they couldn't carry it together." The photograph now hangs in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Its label reads simply, "This photograph captures a friendship that was not supposed to exist, but did." Visitors still stop in front of it, not for the family posed so carefully at the front of the frame, but for the two small figures behind them, half in shadow, playing a game neither of them knew was already, quietly, an act of defiance. Some visitors linger a long time. A few, Thomas has noticed, cry. Most simply stand there, looking at two boys who couldn't have known what would happen to either of them, and who somehow, decades and a war apart, ended up living out the same answer anyway.